You find yourself in a small, dimly lit bedroom in mid-19th century London. The year is 1857, and the air is still with the faint scent of rosewater and starch. Outside, the gaslights flicker in the fog. Inside, it's quieter still. A wooden armoire creaks slightly as it settles. On a chair, carefully folded, lies a blue muslin day dress. But what catches your eye is the corset. It rests alone on the bed, its whalebone stiffeners and intricate lace trim forming an elegant, skeletal shape, like something meant not just to be worn, but to reshape the very body, and by extension, the person. The corset, in the Victorian world, was more than clothing. It was a philosophy together from discipline, desire, morality, and fear. It did not just mold the waist, it molded reputations, marriages, medical diagnoses, and entire categories of social worth. What was worn beneath the clothes mattered as much as what was visible to the eye. Let's begin, therein, the quiet moments of dressing, where the day truly started for a woman of respectable standing. But first, tell us in comments from which country are you watching from. And if you like our content, kindly subscribe the channel to help grow our community. Now back to the story. In most middle and upper class homes, a woman would not dress herself entirely alone. Her maid, often younger, less adorned, and corseted more loosely, would help with the laces. First, a chemise, then the corset. It was pulled snug and tied in a firm bow. The ideal waist for a fashionable woman hovered between 18 and 22 inches. For reference, that's smaller than most modern mannequins. This daily ritual was about more than shape. The corset trained posture, regulated movement, and even affected breathing. A woman who wore her corset too loosely might be thought morally slack and disciplined, indulgent, even sexually suggestive. A tightly corseted figure, however, announced a form of self-control that was central to Victorian ideals of femininity. Ironically, the same body that was meant to appear chaste and modest was, through the corset's visual exaggeration, rendered sexually alluring. The paradox was never openly acknowledged, but it was deeply felt. To understand the corset is to understand how the Victorians interpreted the human body, not as an individual possession, but as a public object. The waist, in particular, became a symbol. A narrow waist suggested refinement, delicacy, and obedience to social norms. It separated ladies from women, and the respectable from the working class. Poorer women wore corsets, too, when they could, but theirs were practical, made of heavier materials, less ornate, and designed for physical work. The working class could not afford to faint from tight lacing. Still, wearing one was a way to perform propriety, a signal that you aspired to restraint. The fashion journals of the time praised the wasp waist in dreamy language. Some articles warned against extremes, but often those warnings served only to reinforce the desirability of the extreme shape. Illustrations were touched up, photographs manipulated. The truth didn't matter as much as the fantasy that the ideal woman, like the corset itself, could be molded. Popular culture tends to caricature Victorian women fainting at the drop of a hat. But the fainting was often very real, and corsetry played a part. When compressed tightly, the lower lungs had less room to expand. Digestion slowed. Heat made it worse. Long periods of sitting or standing without movement further strained the body. And yet, fainting became, in its own way, an acceptable form of female protesta, socially permissible way to escape unwanted attention. Stifling rooms, or emotionally intense conversations. To faint was to momentarily leave the scene, to retreat inward, and it was rarely questioned, especially if your corset was laced just a bit too tight. This strange blend of physical collapse and social acceptability made fainting both a symptom and a performance. No one expected a delicate woman to withstand all things. In fact, delicacy was the goal. For many women, the corset was not removed in the bedroom, not even on the wedding night. Some marriage corsets had special features, removable panels, hidden clasps so that modesty could be preserved while still allowing access. The idea of undressing fully, of being entirely unclothed in front of one's husband, was often viewed as inappropriate even within the sanctity of marriage. Modesty was not merely encouraged, it was institutionalized. The sight of a bare ankle in the wrong context was more scandalous than a form-fitting bodice. A woman's underthings were rarely discussed openly. Even in medical texts, the female body was often illustrated draped in sheets. Victorian men, especially those from polite society, were trained to revere modesty as moral superiority. And yet, they were also steeped in a culture of contradiction, one where prostitutes were numerous and erotic literature flourished in secret. The corset then existed at this crossroad, a visible emblem of virtue and an invisible tool of seduction, a signal of sexual inaccessibility that simultaneously drew attention to the body it concealed. Medical opinion on corsetry was divided, but growing increasingly critical by the 1860s. Some doctors denounced tight lacing, linking it to respiratory distress, digestive issues, displacement of organs, and fertility problems. Corset liver was not just a nickname, it was a documented deformation. Yet others defended moderate corsetry, arguing it promoted better posture and discouraged immodest movement. These were not small claims. In an era when female movement was considered a potential site of sexual temptation, limiting that movement had moral implications. Still others went further, arguing that the corset could protect young women from touching themselves or others, a sort of chastity armor, protecting the body by binding it. Medical diagrams from the era show internal organs squeezed unnaturally, lungs displaced, ribs deformed. But fashion, once moralized, was hard to argue against. Health was secondary to social standing, and standing came, often literally, from posture, from the corset. Imagine, for a moment, a woman of means sitting down to write a letter. Her waist aches. She adjusts her seating, slowly, carefully. She cannot slouch, cannot bend at the middle. The corset keeps her spine upright. Her breath comes in shallow draws, but she's grown used to it. Her thoughts turn inward as her body remains bound. She's aware of every movement. She knows how to sit, stand, enter a room. She has been trained, not just by etiquette, but by the shaping of her clothes, by the way her body must always yield to the garment. She is not free, but she is admired. And somewhere deep in her subconscious, perhaps she wonders, is the admiration worth the breathless silence she must inhabit? The corset told a story long before a woman ever spoke. It declared that she was obedient, proper, desirable, but untouchable. It limited her range of motion, and in doing so, it also limited her possibilities. The garments enforced posture, yes, but also performed a kind of social fencing, drawing boundaries around who she could be and how she could live. Even more than that, it created a barrier of silence, because talking about one's underclothes was taboo. Women suffered pain, shortness of breath, even fainting fits, but rarely spoke of it openly. There were no support groups for tea-tasting, no open rebellions against whalebone and silk, only murmured discomfort and quiet endurance. Over time, the corset became both feared and revered, feared for its medical consequences, revered for its social power. And when its dominance eventually faded, it did so, not with a grand revolution, but with a quiet slipping away. But we are not there yet, for now, in 1857, the corset remains. It shapes not only the body, but the woman. And in shaping the woman, it reshapes the world she lives in. In the softly lit parlor of a well-appointed Victorian home, a woman sits perfectly upright, her corset firm against her spine. She is pale, quiet, and prone to spells of faintness, sudden tears, or inexplicable nervousness. She has no words for her sensations, only that she feels unwell in a way that seems to defy naming. Her husband calls the doctor, and the doctor, in turn, has just the word for it: hysteria. Few diagnoses have lingered in the cultural imagination quite like hysteria. But in the Victorian era, it was not seen as a vague or poetic condition. It was widely accepted as a genuine medical diagnosis, one linked exclusively to women and the perceived instability of their reproductive systems. The very word comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. Hysteria was thought to be a kind of internal restlessness of the womb, an ancient notion that still echoed loudly in 19th century medicine, at a time when women were expected to be demure, quiet, and modest in both behavior and speech. Hysteria became a catch-all term for nearly any deviation from this ideal. A woman who cried to Italy, laughed inappropriately, displayed irritability, anxiety, or sexual desire outside of prescribed norms could be said to suffer from hysteria. The diagnosis was expansive and conveniently unprovable. Doctors who examined women for hysteria did so under the strict codes of Victorian modesty. Physical examinations of the female body were performed rarely and always with great delicacy. Some physicians would refuse to speak aloud the word uterus in the presence of women, referring to it obliquely or simply as the region. The idea of a man examining a woman for a sexual or reproductive complaint was so loaded with moral tension that entire systems of euphemism were built around it. When physical treatments were needed, they were often carried out in secrecy, and sometimes by midwives or female nurses rather than male doctors. Yet the physicians wrote the prescriptions, and their writings shaped the treatment of women for decades. One of the most curious aspects of Victorian hysteria was the treatment method commonly known as pelvic massage. This was a manual stimulation of the female genitals performed by a doctor in order to induce what was termed a paroxysm. The paroxysm was, in truth, an orgasm, but no one used the word. Most medical texts of the time described it as a convulsive release of nervous energy necessary to relieve hysteria. The treatments could take a long time. Some physicians found them exhausting. They were, of course, conducted with all the outward appearance of professionalism and detachment. The curious thing is that neither doctors nor patients described these sessions in sexual terms. In the tightly corseted world of Victorian morality, even this intimate and invasive practice could be reimagined as a purely medical act, clinical, necessary, respectable. The widespread need for this treatment led, inevitably, to technological innovation. The first electromechanical vibrators were developed in the late 19th century by doctors seeking a more efficient way to induce the therapeutic paroxysm without the physical fatigue. These machines were bulky, mechanical, and only available in medical settings at first. But by the turn of the century, they would be found in mail-order catalogs, marketed not as sexual devices, but as health appliances. Few women, and even fewer men, would openly admit what these machines actually did. All of this was made possible by the social construction of modesty. In the Victorian imagination, modest women were not sexual creatures. They did not desire. They did not even understand. Therefore, any activity that involved sexual stimulation, if framed correctly, could be made invisible even to the participants. The body could be touched, treated, even manipulated, without ever being acknowledged as a site of pleasure. Medical literature of the time was filled with contradictions. On one hand, doctors warned that sexual activity in women could cause hysteria. On the other, they prescribed pelvic massage as a cure for it. Masturbation, they insisted, was dangerous for women, an activity that could lead to madness, infertility, or moral collapse. Yet the mechanical vibrator could be sold as a health product, and the therapeutic paroxysm could be induced again and again without shame or scandal. All of this was held together by silence. The silence of the doctor, who never said the word orgasm. The silence of the woman, who never asked. The silence of a society that defined modesty so narrowly that the most intimate procedures could exist unnoticed beneath its skirts. One might wonder why hysteria seemed to affect middle and upper-class women more than their working-class counterparts. Perhaps the answer lies in lifestyle. The leisured woman, bound by etiquette and fashion, had fewer outlets for emotion or physical activity. She had time to feel nervous, restless, or melancholic. She had the luxury to be unwell in a way that could be medicalized. The working woman, corseted though she may have been, was too busy for fainting spells and doctor visits. Her emotional distress had no name, no prescription. At its core, hysteria was not about medicine. It was about control. It allowed male doctors to explain and manage the behavior of women in a world that gave them few other tools. It provided a diagnosis for non-compliance, for unhappiness, for desire, for anger. It allowed women to be ill without being disobedient, and to seek touch without breaking modesty. And it allowed society to reinforce the central myth of the era, that women were naturally delicate, irrational, and in need of careful moral supervision. As the century progressed, hysteria would morph. The diagnosis would fall in and out of fashion. New theories would emerge: nervous exhaustion, neurasthenia, female melancholy. But the underlying impulse remained the same: to pathologize the natural consequences of a life lived in restriction. The corset may have squeezed the ribs and lungs, but hysteria squeezed something deeper: the vocabulary for suffering. Women could not say what they wanted, what they feared, or what they felt, so they became hysterical, and the doctors gave them treatments that mimicked care while maintaining silence. In the quiet hours of the night, in the candlelit bedrooms of the respectable, there were many women lying awakened, able to breathe deeply, unable to move freely, unable to name the aching within them. They were dressed modestly, behaved properly, and were utterly miserable, but they were not allowed to say so. What happens when an entire culture invents medical conditions just to preserve an illusion? And when a treatment becomes indistinguishable from repression, how can anyone tell the difference? In the pale stillness of the Victorian bedroom, even the furniture seemed to whisper restraint. The bed was a place of silence, both literally and symbolically. In the homes of the respectable, sheets were heavy and opaque. Draperies fell from canopy rods and shut out even the faintest suspicion of immodesty. And yet, it was in this cloistered space, this hushed room of whispers and nightgowns, that some of the most bewildering customs of Victorian sexual life took place. Married couples, it was said, should engage in intimacy without ever fully undressing. For many, even the act of removing one's nightgown entirely was considered indecent. There are documented cases of couples sleeping in what were known as modesty garments, specially tailored sleeping wear with discreet slits allowing for physical union, while still preserving the appearance of moral decorum. The very design of these clothes implied an anxiety not just about sex itself, but about the appearance of participating in it. Sheets were often used as shields, both literal and symbolic. In some traditions, particularly in highly religious or aristocratic circles, a white sheet would be draped over the woman's lower half during intercourse. This preserved modesty and avoided the embarrassment of full nudity. In some cases, the lights were never lit. Some newlyweds claimed not to have seen one another's bodies until years into marriage. Of course, the customs varied by region, religion, and social class, but what remained remarkably consistent across the English-speaking Victorian world was the deep discomfort with acknowledging the body as a site of shared pleasure. Women, in particular, were instructed through books, sermons, and whispered maternal guidance that their duty in the bedroom was one of quiet tolerance. Passion, desire, or active enjoyment were considered either sinful or worse, masculine. One influential text of the time, The Wedding Night by Ruth Smithers, often falsely attributed but widely circulated in the period, advised women to lie still, close your eyes, and think of England. Though apocryphal in origin, the sentiment captures the ethos of Victorian sexual duty. Wives were expected to endure, not enjoy. Among upper and middle-class women, many entered marriage with almost no understanding of what the act of consummation actually entailed. The culture of silence around sexuality was so profound that even menstruation was rarely explained. Some young brides thought sex would resemble a kiss, or that children were conceived through proximity or prayer. The sudden confrontation with the reality of physical intimacy could be traumatic, especially when paired with a partner who was equally uninformed or worse, dismissive. Doctors, too, played a strange role in this dynamic. Many advised minimal sexual activity in marriage, arguing that women were naturally passive and that frequent sex could be damaging to their health. Some went so far as to suggest that female orgasm was not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous, believed to stir the nerves or contribute to hysteria. But this view, while dominant, was not universal. A few progressive medical voices in the 19th century began to challenge the notion that female sexuality was non-existent or pathological. They observed, often quietly and cautiously, that some women did enjoy sex, and that intimacy could strengthen the marital bond. These voices, however, were often drowned out by the louder symphony of propriety and fear. Within marriage manuals, published discreetly and sold through coded catalogs, sex was discussed with euphemism and metaphor. The language was tender, cautious, and often spiritualized. Sex was framed as a sacred dutia, mysterious ritual that, if conducted properly, would preserve health and happiness. Yet, rarely did these manuals describe the anatomy involved or the sensations expected. The function of sex was reproductive. Its design was divine. Its reality, however, was often deeply confusing. Hygiene, too, played an unexpected role. Victorian Britain had a rising obsession with sanitation, which extended into the marital bed. Women were advised to perform internal douching after intercourse, to cleanse the womb both for health reasons and to preserve the sense of moral cleanliness. Doctors sold syringes and washes for this purpose, sometimes under the guise of feminine freshness. Many of these products were caustic or ineffective, and few women had the knowledge to evaluate them safely. Infertility, though rarely spoken of openly, was a quiet crisis for many couples. Women were typically blamed, regardless of medical fact. If a child did not come, it was assumed to be a fault of the woman's body, her character, or her sinfulness. The notion that a man might be infertile was considered laughable or insulting, and so women submitted to strange treatments, restrictive diets, and even exorcisms, while their husbands remained unquestioned. One can imagine then the quiet pain of a couple who wanted children and could not have them, or the awkward silence between newlyweds who did not understand how children were made, or the humiliation of a woman sent to a doctor, alone, to inquire about her barrenness only, to be examined with cold instruments and colder judgment. In poorer communities, some knowledge passed through whispered traditions and shared experience. Working-class women who lived in closer quarters and lacked the insulation of elaborate modesty rituals often had more practical understanding of sex and childbirth. But they also had fewer protections. Many were subject to marital rape, forced pregnancies, or abuse without recourse. The law did not recognize marital rape as a crime until the late 20th century. In the Victorian era, a husband's access to his wife's body was total, legal, and unquestioned. Pregnancy itself was both a visible triumph and a private burden. It was not uncommon for women to hide their pregnancies well into the later months using wide dresses, corsetry, or strategic absences from social life. The belly, once it became too obvious, was reason to withdraw from public events. A woman might go to the country or take a rest cure to preserve the illusion of decorum. To speak openly about conception was taboo. Even to mention that one was expecting was considered vulgar in some circles. Euphemisms, such as "in the family way" or "indisposed," were preferred. Childbirth itself was often solitary, attended by midwives or female relatives, with the husband kept away. Pain relief, if offered, was rudimentary. Chloroform became more widely used after Queen Victoria famously accepted it for the birth of her 8th child in 1853, an act that helped to normalize its use. But prior to that, many believed pain was a necessary part of womanhood, a divine punishment inherited from Eve. And when complications arose, as they often did, medical intervention was slow. Instruments were crude, sanitation was poor, mortality rates were high, and yet all of it remained wrapped in a veil of silence. Women who died in childbirth were eulogized for their virtue, not mourned for the systemic failures that contributed to their deaths. Behind the layers of lace, linen, and moral restraint, the Victorian bedroom was not a place of refuge. It was a stage one where roles were rigid, scripts were vague, and the consequences were lasting. And yet, generation after generation entered that room with little more than hope and obligation. One wonders, what happens when a culture prizes purity so highly that it forgets to prepare its people for the realities of life? And what did these silent customs cost, not just in terms of suffering, but in terms of connection, knowledge, and joy? Below the grand rooms of Victorian houses, beneath the drawing rooms, parlors, and bedrooms, veiled in floral wallpaper and silk, lay a quieter, harsher world. It was the domain of the domestic servant, vast and invisible workforce of maids, cooks, housekeepers, footmen, and butlers who made respectable life possible for the families above. They were everywhere, yet they were not to be seen. Their presence was meant to be felt, not noticed. Their voices, if heard at all, came only in hushed tones from doorways and stairwells. In the rigid hierarchy of Victorian society, the servant class lived by a separate but parallel code, one just as deeply bound by ideas of propriety, shame, and unspoken realities. But in the world below stairs, vice and virtue were measured differently, not by corset size or tea time etiquette, but by necessity, vulnerability, and survival. Young girls from the countryside, some as young as 12, came to the cities to enter domestic service. For many, it was the only respectable form of employment available. They would begin as scullery maids or kitchen girls, rising through the ranks to lady's maid or housekeeper, if they were lucky, and remained unblemished by scandal. But scandal came easily in a household where the boundaries between privacy and power were so thin. It was common for young female servants to be subject to the advances of their employers, especially in homes where the master of the house kept late hours or took an unusual interest in the cleaning schedule. There were no legal protections. A maid who became pregnant would almost always be dismissed. Her reputation ruined, her income gone, her future bleak. The master, on the other hand, faced no real consequence. His reputation remained intact. The burden of morality rested entirely on the girl. Household manuals from the period gave ample instructions for preventing theft or laziness among servants, but said very little about protecting them from exploitation. When female virtue was spoken of in relation to the lower classes, it was usually in the context of containment, keeping the servants in line, rather than keeping the employers in check. Some homes implemented strict no fraternizing rules, forbidding servants from speaking to one another in the halls, or from ever being alone together. These rules were intended to prevent romance, gossip, and possible scandal. In other houses, long hours and cramped sleeping quarters made such rules unenforceable. The servants, like everyone else, lived lives of feeling and desire, though they had less freedom to express or pursue either. The reality of servant life was full of contradiction. Officially, they were supposed to be invisible, selfless, asexual. In practice, they were often the unseen witnesses of their employers' most private Habitson-made beds, soiled undergarments, overheard arguments. Some even assisted in dressing and undressing their mistresses, handling their corsets, their chemises, their garters. The intimate knowledge ran both ways. There are letters, journals, and occasional court testimonies that describe these quiet, blurred boundaries. A maid might become the confidant of her mistress, sharing whispered thoughts behind closed doors. A footman might attract the inappropriate attentions of a daughter in the household. Occasionally, a maid and a master would fall into an open affair brief, scandalous and ruinous. But far more common were the moments that went unrecorded. The brush of a hand, the too long glance, the sudden silence as footsteps passed the doorway. Prostitution and domestic service overlapped in the public imagination. Victorian Britain was filled with anxiety about the fallen woman, a term that encompassed not only prostitutes, but any woman who had lost her virginity outside of marriage, willingly or not. Servants were often accused of being morally suspect simply by virtue of their station. If a maid walked alone at night, it was assumed she might be selling herself. If she wore something stylish, it was whispered that she must have a gentleman friend. This suspicion created a constant pressure. Servants had to appear modest, obedient, and utterly grateful. Any hint of flirtation or assertiveness could be grounds for dismissal. And yet they worked in close proximity to their employers, shared spaces and glances, and sometimes received gifts, new shoes, a few shillings, a lock of hair. Charity organizations, especially those run by religious groups, attempted to rescue servant girls who had become pregnant or were suspected of impropriety. Some were sent to asylums, others to workhouses. The luckier ones found placement in institutions for fallen women, where they underwent moral re-education. The re-education often included prayer, silence, hard labor, and years of confinement. Meanwhile, the respectable households above stairs remained untouched. The lady of the house might never know, or choose not to know, what happened to the maid who vanished one morning without warning. She might believe the girl was called away, or had become unsuitable. The polite lie was enough to keep the veneer of morality intact. But the servants remembered. They remembered the whispers, the punishments, the late-night footsteps on staircases that creaked. They remembered the doctor's visits arranged in secret, the quiet weeping behind pantry doors, the blood-stained sheets hurriedly boiled before dawn. And they remembered the feeling of being watched, judged, and always replaceable. Yet, within that difficult world, there were moments of tenderness too. Servants formed bonds with one another, sisters in hardship. They shared stories, food, clothing, and advice. Older maids taught younger ones how to navigate unwanted attention. Footmen passed love notes beneath dinner trays. Housekeepers turned a blind eye when it served compassion more than rules. They carved out spaces for joy in small ways, a new ribbon in the hair, a quiet song while scrubbing the floor, a stolen moment by the scullery door, watching the world pass by. Though society branded them as lower and lesser, the servant class held up the very architecture of Victorian respectability. They washed the corsets, scrubbed the chamber pots, prepared the marriage beds. They knew what the families pretended not to know. And while the respectable talked about vice in the abstract, debated it in pamphlets and sermons, the servants lived within its consequences, navigating the narrow line between survival and shame. What does it mean when a society rests its morals on those who are never allowed to speak? And when virtue is only visible from above, what truths remain hidden in the rooms below? It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic moment when Victorian society took off its corset, set it aflame, and declared itself free. No single year, law, or scandal that brought the edifice crashing down. Instead, the collapse was quite a slow unraveling that took place over decades, often unnoticed, beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The corset, once the most iconic garment of propriety and femininity, began to shift in meaning by the close of the 19th century. Where once it had symbolized self-control, now it whispered of repression. Where once it shaped the ideal woman, now it began to suggest a body not her own. Feminists, doctors, social reformers, and even fashion designers began to question its value. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, was one of the earliest formal bodies to publicly advocate against tight-lacing and restrictive clothing. They weren't necessarily interested in sexual liberation, but rather in function. The simple, radical idea that women should be able to breathe, walk, and work without pain. Medical professionals, once apologists for the corset, began to speak more candidly. Doctors published papers detailing the effects of tight lacing on internal organs, digestion, and childbirth. Some took 2 public lectures, displaying models of distorted rib cages and displaced wombs to shock audiences into awareness. The body, they warned, had its limits even for the most virtuous woman. At the same time, the women wearing these garments were changing. The Industrial Revolution had brought more women into the public sphere. Women worked in factories, offices, hospitals, and eventually universities. They rode bicycles, took long walks, and even hiked mountains. The corset was simply impractical for many of these pursuits, yet fashion lagged behind reality. The hourglass silhouette remained in vogue well into the early 20th century, even as looser styles gained popularity among bohemians and reformers. It would take a shift in the very concept of femininity to truly begin the unbinding. And so it came, as it often does, through war. During World War I, corset manufacturing materials, especially steel, were redirected to the war effort. Women took on roles traditionally held by men. In factories, on farms, and in offices, the tightly laced silhouette gave way to freer, simpler clothing. Fashion adapted. The dropped waist of the 1920s flapper, loose and boyish, would have been unthinkable only 2 generations earlier. But now it felt inevitable. By then, the damage had already been done, not just to the body, but to the psyche. The Victorian corset, like the social codes it reinforced, had left its mark. Women had been taught to value silence over expression, modesty over curiosity, and compliance over desire. Even as they shed the garment, they carried its memory. The bedchamber, too, began to change. The rituals of marriage shifted. The veil of secrecy over sex and the body thinned ever so slightly. Books about intimacy, reproduction, and health circulated more openly. Clinics and midwives became more accessible. Feminist thinkers began to publish on topics previously deemed unfit for public discourse: menstruation, anatomy, desire. But change brought its own discomforts. For many, the collapse of the old order felt like a loss, not a liberation. Without the corset, what was womanhood? Without the marriage sheet, what proved purity? Without silence, what filled the void? Some clung to the old ways. Etiquette manuals were still printed. Corsets, albeit redesigned, remained in fashion for formal wear. Victorian ideals lingered well into the 20th century, haunting mothers, daughters, and doctors alike. Yet history continued its slow, quiet march. The servant girl with the ribbon in her hair now had a daughter who might attend school. The housewife who once fainted from tight lacing now had a granddaughter who bicycled in bloomers. The master who once avoided speaking of such matters now had a grandson studying Freud. The empire of propriety did not fall in a dramatic coup, but in a collective shrug. 1,000 small choices, daily discomforts, and private rebellions wore it down until its structure, so carefully constructed, simply failed to hold. What remained were the questions. What is a body when it belongs to itself? What is virtue without shame? What does intimacy mean when silence no longer guards it? These are the remnants of the Victorian corset, not just the garment, but the world it held together. And though the silk may have softened and the laces long untied, the shape of that world still echoes in the spaces we move through today. The corset may be gone, but we are still learning how to breathe without it. Story 2. Brothels. By the flickering gaslight of London's winding alleys, where the soot of industry clung to every brick and the air carried the sour smell of coal smoke and wet wool, a quieter economy thrived just beyond the reach of the moralizers and the reformers. Victorian brothels were not merely dens of vice, they were institutions with their own hierarchies, rituals, and roles woven into the urban fabric with all the discretion that hypocrisy required. The brothel, as a structure, was neither entirely hidden nor openly accepted. It sat somewhere in the realm of tolerated secrecy, its presence acknowledged in whispers and sidelong glances, its function understood but rarely spoken of in polite society. In London alone, it was estimated that by the mid-19th century, over 8,000 women were engaged in some form of sex work, and yet the city's official stance was one of denial, save for the occasional moral panic or police crackdown. Most brothels were small establishments, simple terraced houses, red or brown brick, tucked behind shops or inside ordinary streets. The doors were unmarked, the curtains were always drawn, but regulars knew where to go, and the madams who ran them understood how to maintain just enough invisibility to avoid notice, yet enough presence to remain known to their clientele. These houses were not the garish, theatrical pleasure houses of Paris or Vienna. They were understated, pragmatic, and often depressingly domestic. The women who worked in them came from all walks of desperation. Many had fled rural poverty. Others had been dismissed from service due to pregnancy or scandal. And some had been born into the trade through mothers who ran or worked in similar establishments. It was rarely a choice made in the absence of hardship. For most, it was simply what remained when all else had closed its doors. Conditions varied greatly. Some brothels offered relative safety, a warm bed, and regular meals. Others were places of danger, dominated by violence, disease, and endless exploitation. Regardless of scale, most operated on a simple system. The madam controlled the house, negotiated prices, and collected a share from each transaction. The women were responsible for entertaining, maintaining appearances, and submitting to the relentless rhythm of work. There was little glamour. The clientele ranged from bored tradesmen to lonely aristocrats. Some came seeking companionship. Others sought power or escape or punishment. The fantasy of the brothel was not always eroticate, was often psychological. In a society built on repression, these spaces offered, for a price, an inversion of control. A man might grovel at a dominatrix's feet, or cry in a prostitute's arms, or simply lie in silence beside another human being. It was less about the act and more about the release. Yet even in these houses of so-called sin, Victorian order seeped in. There were rules. Girls were expected to dress modestly until summoned. Clients were vetted for cleanliness and conduct. Some brothels enforced schedules and curfews, imposed fines for disobedience, and kept detailed ledgers carefully maintained to track not just money, but behavior. It was, in its own grim way, a business. Above all, discretion was sacred. A madam who allowed her girls to gossip or her clients to be recognized risked everything. Respectability, even in disrepute, had its boundaries. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of these institutions was how they mirrored the society that condemned them. Brothels reproduced class structures within their walls. The madam as mistress of the house, the senior girls as upper servants, the newer ones as scullery maids of flesh. Some even had strict hierarchies regarding who could entertain which types of clients. There were brothels for the working class and brothels for the wealthy, each performing the same rituals with vastly different language and rules of engagement. The irony, of course, was that the same men who passed laws to police women's behavior often sat quietly in these parlors, tipping their hats and removing their gloves as they settled into the armchairs beside flickering fireplaces. Outside, the debates raged. The contagious diseases acts of the 1860s sought to regulate and medically inspect sex workers under the guise of protecting soldiers and sailors from venereal disease. Feminists, most notably Josephine Butler, led campaigns against these laws, exposing the double standard they represented. A man infected a woman, and the woman was punished. The man left untouched. The brothel, in its quiet way, stood as a monument to this imbalance. It existed because society needed it to. It thrived because hypocrisy allowed it to. And it endured because, behind its closed curtains, it served a need no amount of virtue could erase. But what did it feel like to live inside one of these houses? Not just to visit or to guess, but to truly inhabit that world, with its codes and rhythms, its dangers and comforts. The interior of the brothel, despite its reputation, was often more ordinary than salacious. Wallpaper yellowing at the corners, threadbare rugs, and second-hand furniture made up the preferment. In the colder months, coal smoke hung in the air and gathered in the lungs. In summer, windows stayed shut to guard against prying eyes, leaving the rooms thick with heat and secrets. A typical day did not begin at dawn. It drifted slowly into focus by early afternoon. The women would wake when the sun was already high, having worked well into the previous night or early morning. They moved about in loose wrappers or worn housecoats, their hair pinned up haphazardly, often eating their first meal in silence, tea that had gone lukewarm and toast that had gone hard. Breakfasts were quiet affairs, held in a shared kitchen or a side room, where conversation was more often about laundry or rumors than emotions. Work began not with customers, but with preparation. Baths were drawn when possible, and cold water splashed when not. Hair was curled, powdered, and arranged. Skin was dabbed with rose water to mask fatigue. Stockings were mended, corsets tightened, and dresses chosen depending on the kind of clientele expected that evening. For those with regular patrons, there were familiar dresses and gestures, an air of false intimacy that could be slipped on as easily as a pair of gloves. Not every woman in the house had a name she used outside. Many adopted pseudonyms, flowery, dramatic, or foreign-sounding to separate the girl who served tea or sewed her own hems from the persona who performed affection upstairs. Lottie or Belle were not real identities, but masks stitched together from novels and whispered dreams, worn with a kind of weary dignity. The house itself operated like a ship, with the madam as captain. She was not always cruel, but she was never soft. Her authority had been earned, not granted, and often through the very same work the girls now performed. She negotiated fees, resolved conflicts, called for doctors or midwives when necessary, and made sure the inspectors, moral or municipal, were kept satisfied. Her success relied not just on profit, but on survival. She walked a line between visible and invisible, ruthless and maternal, feared and respected. Each woman kept her own room, though room was a generous word. Some were little more than large cupboards with a bed and a washstand. Others had more comfort, perhaps a mirror, a rug, a small bookshelf. They decorated them with scraps, a cutout from a fashion magazine, a bit of lace, a dried flower pressed into a frame. It was, after all, the only private space most of them had. Their clients blurred together, faces remembered only through quirks or habits. The man who always requested his tea a certain way, the one who cried afterward, the quiet ones, the cruel ones, the generous ones. Sometimes a client returned so often that the boundary between transaction and attachment became dangerously thin. Affection was the most expensive service, and the most difficult to fake for long. There was little in the way of protection. Condoms existed, but were neither reliable nor commonly insisted upon. Disease was common, and though some brothels kept bottles of carbolic acid or tinctures of mercury in the house, prevention was uneven and painful. When illness came, a girl might rest, but more often she worked through it. There were mouths to feed, sometimes her own, sometimes a child in a boarding house, sometimes a sibling far away who believed she worked in a laundry or as a seamstress. Pimps and protectors were common in the lower houses, but less so in the mid-tier ones. Instead, women relied on each other. Friendships could be tentative, built in silence and shared weariness, but they were real. Someone always had a thread and needle. Someone always knew how to mix a tonic. Someone always listened, even if she didn't speak. The bond of proximity was strong, even when trust was not. But there were betrayals, too. Jealousies flared when a client favored one girl too often. Resentments simmered over earnings or favoritism. In some houses, there was competition for the attention of wealthy patrons, with gifts or promises of being kept, the Victorian euphemism for being financially supported outside the house. To be kept was seen by some as escape, by others as another kind of confinement. Time passed strangely. Days were spent in dim rooms with drawn curtains, nights in candlelight or gaslight, listening to footsteps on stairs, voices in hallways, creaking floorboards. Sundays, when the house often rested, were oddly disorienting. Some women went to church, others took walks if it was safe to do so. But most remained in sewing or reading, trying to reclaim some sense of quiet that did not come with a price. Letters were rarely sent. To write home meant pretending or lying. To receive a letter often meant news too painful to bear. Still, they came tucked between bodices or hidden in drawers, read over and over again until the creases wore thin. A mother's health, a child's birthday, a sister's wedding, details from a life left behind, now unreachable. Despite it all, there was a rhythm to a pattern that numbed and sustained. The brothel was a place of contradiction. It was prison and sanctuary, workplace and living space, danger and stability. For some, it was a sentence. For others, it was a choice. And for many, it was simply what the world had made available. But the world was shifting. Public debates about morality, sanitation, and law were growing louder. Campaigners were walking the streets with pamphlets. Policemen were under pressure to raid more houses. Reformers were founding shelters and workhouses, preaching salvation in the language of shame. The street outside was no longer as quiet as it had once been, and so the question loomed. Could the brothel, so entrenched in secrecy and necessities, survive in a world that now wanted it both exposed and eradicated? In the final section, we'll turn to the public war over brothels, the debates, the raids, the protest sand, the surprising ways some women fought back. By the early hours of morning, long after the last footsteps had faded from the hallway, the brothel would settle into its rarest state silence, not true stillness, for even then the house remained alert, listening for knocks at the wrong hour or the crash of a drunkard's return. But in those hushed moments, behind drawn curtains and under thin sheets, the women rested with the practiced stillness of those who must always be ready to rise again. What rarely makes it into the moral accounts and parliamentary debates is what happened after the doors closed. Life did not stop between clients. It wound itself into the spaces between encounters between skin and skin. Morning brought routines just as rigid as those in respectable households. There was cleaning to be done, bed linens to be washed, hair to be brushed, corsets to be mended, candles to be trimmed. Brothels, like all Victorian households, were maintained by labor domestic, invisible, constant. Most of the women shared rooms, sometimes beds, not by choice, but by necessity. Privacy was rare and intimacy inevitable. Friendships bloomed out of routine, the way one girl always shared her tea, the quiet nod of another when it was time to step in during a rough appointment. Sometimes they fought, especially over clients or wages withheld. Sometimes they looked out for one another with a ferocity unknown in drawing rooms or parlors. There were moments of levity, too. Laughter spilled across stairwells when someone read aloud from the scandal sheets, mocking a lord who had fallen from grace, particularly if he had once visited their house. Songs were sung while scrubbing floors, lullabies hummed not to children but to one another in rare gestures of comfort. Birthdays were marked with a slice of fruitcake or a shared nip of gin. In a world that treated them as disposable, these moments became quiet rebellions of humanity. Disease, however, was the ever-present shadow. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and tuberculosis moved silently through brothels, often unchecked. Doctors, if they came at all, came to inspect, not to heal. Under the Contagious Diseases Acts, women suspected of prostitution could be forcibly examined and detained. It was not uncommon for a girl to disappear for weeks after being taken to a lock. Hospital places meant for treatment, but often acting as jails. The stigma did not vanish with recovery. Some never returned, and still the brothel endured. It had to. Many women had no other means of survival. Charitable homes might offer brief refuge, but they demanded repentance and obedience, and most were full. Service was hard to return to once a woman had fallen. The brothel became not just a place of work, but the closest thing to stability some women would know. They formed something like families, fractured, conditional, but real. Madams, despite their power, lived on the edge. Their fortunes could turn with a single raid or a vengeful neighbor. Some protected their girls fiercely, enforcing strict rules and keeping violent clients at bay. Others were exploitative, working with pimps and police to maintain control. There were no unions, no regulations, no true protections. Everything depended on the house's own internal code. To outsiders, these women were often flattened into types: the fallen woman, the seductress, the victim, the criminal. But within the walls of the brothel, they were simply people, full of contradictions and complexities. Some still wrote letters home, telling half-truths about city life. Others dreamed of saving enough to start a shop or emigrate. A few found love, or something like it, with regular clients. many found only repetition and fatigue. The brothel was not a symbol. It was a lived reality, mundane, cruel, occasionally kind, but always shaped by the needs and hypocrisies of the society that built it. The very forces that made sex work shameful also made it inescapable. Lack of education, rigid class structures, limited employment for women, and a legal system that punished poverty. As the 19th century waned, changes began to stir. Campaigns against the contagious diseases acts gained ground. The rise of social reform movements pushed for better conditions for working women. Some brothels closed, others shifted to more discreet arrangements, private rooms above pubs or apartments managed quietly by women themselves. The grand era of the Victorian brothel faded, but the trade itself never vanished. It only changed its shape. And so, the story of the brothel is not just one of vice and scandal. It is a mirror held to a society that demanded purity but tolerated exploitation. It is the story of women navigating limited choices with resilience, with cunning, and with quiet endurance. Their names were rarely recorded, their voices seldom heard. Yet their existence touched every layer of Victorian life, from the cobbler on the corner to the member of Parliament who passed laws in the name of virtue. What does it say about a society that hides its needs behind velvet curtains and condemns the very people who fulfill them? Perhaps more than anything else, the brothel forces us to confront not just the lives of the women within, but the double standards of the world outside. Story, purity. In Victorian England, purity was not just a virtue, it was a performance and an expectation heavy enough to warp entire lives. For women, especially, it became the very currency of their social worth. The ideal of the pure woman, chaste, modest, silent, and self-sacrificing, was etched into sermons, novels, etiquette books, and dinner-table conversations. It hovered above every drawing room like a chandelier, beautiful, delicate, and constantly at risk of crashing down with the smallest misstep. This purity was not measured by truth, but by appearance. A woman might harbor rebellious thoughts, or even quiet desires, but as long as her conduct aligned with social expectation, no raised voice, no improper company, no visible ambition, she could maintain her standing. The illusion of innocence mattered more than the facts. A blush could be cultivated. Modesty could be rehearsed. The performance was relentless. Girls were trained from childhood to embody this ideal. They learned to sit with ankles crossed, to lower their eyes when speaking to men, to suppress curiosity and defer to authority. Education for middle-class girls rarely extended beyond domestic skills and religious instruction. Biology was taboo. The body, and especially the female body, was a source of discomfort, something to be disciplined, concealed, and discussed only in euphemism. Menstruation was referred to as the curse. Desire was never mentioned at all. For married women, purity took on new contradictions. They were expected to transform from virginal brides to dutiful wives overnight, to perform sexually for their husbands without ever appearing to enjoy it. A respectable woman had no needs of her own, only obligations. Her virtue was her shield, her burden, and her prison. If she failed to please her husband, he might stab, but society would blame her. If she showed interest, she risked being seen as indecent. The line between virtue and shame was razor thin and drawn entirely by men. Men, by contrast, were not bound by the same code. They were expected to have experience before marriage and to satisfy their appetites discreetly. The double standard was so deeply entrenched that entire institutions, brothels, mistress-keeping, private clubs, were built to accommodate it. A man could sow wild oats and still be considered an eligible bachelor. A woman with one misstep was often ruined beyond repair. The consequences of violating the purity code were severe. A woman caught in an affair or even suspected of one could be cast out of her family, disowned, unemployable, and socially dead. She might be forced into sex work to survive, the very thing her fall from purity had supposedly made inevitable. Her lover, meanwhile, would often continue his life unblemished. In court, in church, in the newspapers, she would be the cautionary tale. Yet, beneath the surface, purity was less about morality and more about control. It preserved male authority, justified social inequality, and made women dependent. It turned virtue into a tool of regulation. Even charitable institutions, like Magdalene asylums, designed to reform fallen women, did so by enforcing silence, shame, and servitude. Redemption, if it came at all, meant total submission. Still, there were women who resisted. Some did so, quietly writing journals, reading forbidden books, questioning the sermons they heard. Others took bolder steps, refusing marriage, founding schools, joining suffrage movements. They challenged the very notion that purity should define them. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft and later George Eliot chipped away at the myth, though not without cost to their reputations, and some simply endured. They kept their secrets, bore their illegitimate children in silence, lived double lives behind lace curtains. They played the role of purity to survive, all the while knowing how fragile, how unfair, how performative it truly was. In the end, Victorian purity was never about the absence of desire, it was about the denial of agency. It was not the reality of innocence that mattered, but the illusion, and for countless women, that illusion came at the price of freedom, truth, and, in many cases, their names written out of history. Story 4. Sheets. In the private world of the Victorian bedroom, sheets held secrets. They weren't just fabric, they were symbols, tools, evidence, and safeguards. Tucked tightly into the creaking iron frames of narrow beds, sheets became part of the machinery of moral control, and often silent witnesses to rituals far more complicated than they appeared. Victorian England wrapped itself in layers of clothing, layers of etiquette, layers of silence, and in the bedroom, these layers persisted. Beds were dressed with care and precision, their linens bleached, pressed, and folded with ritualistic attention. White, cotton, or linen sheets were prized. They signaled cleanliness, respectability, and restraint. A stained sheet, particularly one spotted with blood, could change a woman's life. In middle and upper-class households, newlyweds often faced their first night together beneath the watchful eye of tradition. It was customary in some families to display the wedding sheets the next morning, proof of consummation, and more importantly, proof of the bride's virginity. A single spot of blood was expected, even demanded. Its absence could spark suspicion, gossip, or worse, accusations of impropriety, annulments, or quiet family scandals handled with bribes and legal silence. A woman's worth could be boiled down to a single night's performance and a smear on white cloth. And yet, the body doesn't always behave according to custom. Many women did not bleed during intercourse. Some families knew this, others did not care. Tales of housemaids instructed to sneak into the marital bedroom and discreetly mark the sheets with chicken blood are not just urban legends. They reflect the very real anxiety surrounding a woman's first night. Sheets had become evidence in a trial where the verdict was predetermined and the defense forbidden to speak. But the role of sheets went beyond wedding night theater. In hospitals and workhouses, sheets were scarce and often unwashed, harboring disease and despair. In brothels, sheets were changed daily, not out of respect for health, but for the performance of cleanliness and illusion of order in a world considered sinful. In modest homes, wives scrubbed and boiled them in copper tubs each week, their hands chapped from lye soap, their backs aching from wringing and hauling. Laundry day was a labor of dignity. Even in death, sheets played a role. The deceased were wrapped in them, white and still, laid out for viewings or shrouded for burial. The same textile that marked a bride's virtue might later hold her corpse. And so the sheet, that humble domestic object, became a stand-in for morality, femininity, and control. It was folded and smoothed and tucked under mattresses with military precision. But it also carried stories, some whispered, some shouted, many never told. It hid bruises, it caught blood, it wrapped babies born in secret, it muffled cries, it bore witness. Rarely did anyone ask the woman under the sheet what she felt. Story 5. Semen. In Victorian England, semen was not merely a bodily fluid. It was, for many, the very essence of manhood, a source of energy, of life, and of moral concern. Scientific ignorance, religious fervor, and cultural anxiety converged to produce a society deeply obsessed with the fluid they dared not name in public. Semen, or, as it was often euphemistically called, the vital fluid, occupied a strange space in the Victorian imagination. Invisible in conversation, but omnipresent in concern. Medical theories of the time regarded semen as a finite and precious resource, drawing heavily on Hippocratic and Galenic ideas that had filtered down through centuries. Many physicians believed that semen was distilled from the blood and spinal fluid. To lose it, therefore, was to drain the body of its vital force. A man who wasted his semenness through masturbation, or what they referred to ominously as self-abuse, risked not just fatigue or moral ruin, but madness, impotence, or early death. This fear reached its apex with the publication of widely read medical texts like Dr. Samuel August Tissot's treatise on the evils of masturbation, which were republished and translated in England. By the 19th century, these ideas were reinforced in household medical manuals, religious tracts, and schoolboy pamphlets, which warned young men of the dangers of nocturnal emissions and the need to protect their seed with all vigilance. Semen was not just physically important. It was morally charged. It was purity, masculinity, and health distilled into one powerful, hidden substance. This obsession birthed entire industries. Medical entrepreneurs and quack doctors marketed elaborate devices to prevent boys from touching themselves, belts with spikes, electric alarms that went off during the night, and specially tailored clothing designed to restrict access to one's genitals. Meanwhile, broadsheets and advertisements offered miracle cures for seminal weakness, nightly losses, and sexual exhaustion. Behind this paranoia lay a deep cultural discomfort with desire itself. Victorian moralists viewed semen not only as sacred, but also as dangerous when misused. The emission of semen without procreative purpose was thought to be not just wasteful, but a crime against nature and God. Married men were cautioned not to indulge too frequently with their wives. lest they render themselves prematurely old. Youthful urges were to be fought with prayer, cold baths, strict diets, and vigorous physical labor. In boarding schools and universities, where large numbers of adolescent boys lived together, the fear of masturbation was particularly intense. Teachers and doctors warned that solitary vice could lead to melancholia, spinal weakness, and even death. Diaries from schoolmasters and physicians detail nighttime inspections, severe punishments, and public shaming rituals. Boys caught in the act were sometimes forced to sleep standing up, wear locked trousers, or write public confessions. All of this to preserve the sanctity of semen. The irony, of course, is that this same culture held a double standard when it came to male sexual privilege. While masturbation and wasting semen were condemned, male visits to prostitutes were often quietly tolerated, if not openly accepted. Brothels catered to all classes, and as long as the encounter was penetrative and not solitary, it was seen as a lesser moral failing, a lapse, rather than a pathology. Meanwhile, the consequences of semen's emission often fell disproportionately on women. The pregnancy, the scandal, the disease, these burdens were rarely borne by the men who caused them. A man's semen might be protected and revered in theory, but once spent irresponsibly, it left others to carry the cost. Women were often blamed for arousing men, accused of ensnaring or provoking lust. And yet they had no control over what happened to the fluid that society imbued with such power. In the medical field, semen was also pathologized and mystified. Victorian doctors published case studies of men who claimed to feel themselves growing weaker after every ejaculation. Some believed that the fluid contained elements of the brain and that its loss diminished intelligence. Others warned that repeated emissions could cause nervous disorders, insanity, or consumption. Semen was medicine and poison, depending on how and when it left the body. Perhaps most revealing were the treatments prescribed for seminal loss. Cold baths, electric shock therapy, and abstinence were common. Diets rich in whole grains, meat, and manly foods were recommended. Some doctors encouraged military training, hunting, or sports as outlets for sexual energy. Others suggested early marriage, though not too early, lest the wife become an accomplice in draining the man's essence. A healthy sex life was permitted only within strict boundaries and only in service of procreation. Even literature was not immune to this cultural fixation. Victorian novels, especially those of the sensation genre, often alluded obliquely to the consequences of indulgence or the perils of temptation. Male characters were praised for self-control, while the fallen man was pitied or punished. Behind these tropes lay an unspoken understanding. Semen lost control meant character lost control. Sexual morality was, at its heart, about managing the emission of a substance seen as both sacred and volatile. In the dark corners of Victorian medicine, a more bizarre set of beliefs also emerged. Some practitioners promoted the ingestion of semen as a restorative, tonic, usually in hushed tones and obscure texts. This idea, while fringe, illustrates the strange reverence held for the substance. It could be poison or cure, proof of masculinity, or a source of shame. It existed in a liminal space between science, superstition, and morality. Today, many of these beliefs seem absurd, if not tragic. The idea that semen loss could drive a man mad, or that masturbation could kill, has been thoroughly discredited. Yet the cultural hangover remains. Modern society may not speak openly about the Victorian anxieties that shaped sexual discourse, but their shadows linger in everything from abstinence, education, to masculinity myths. In the end, the Victorian obsession with semen was never about biology. It was about control of the body, of desire, of morality. A substance that could not be seen or held in polite conversation became the battleground for an entire society's struggle with its impulses. And beneath all the science and sermon, one truth remained. No amount of fear could suppress the body's quiet insistence on being itself.